So today's tutorial is going to talk about Adobe Camera Raw. So first things first, we're going to open up Bridge. Bridge is our file management system. So choose any of your raw images. In my case, we're going to use a CR2, which is a Canon raw image file. I'm going to double click on that and it will automatically open into Adobe's Camera Raw, which is a precursor program for Photoshop. So we're really going to focus on the basic and the detail panel. So the basic panel is going to have our white balance to start. So that's the first thing you want to do, is adjust the white balance if necessary or if needed. So there are 3 ways to adjust white balance. You can use this little drop-down menu and select any of the preset options. So for instance, if I pick daylight, you're going to see it kind of goes a bit warmer. If I pick cloudy, it's going to go even warmer yet, because typically cloudy is going to be a cooler environment. If I pick fluorescent, it's going to go much cooler because fluorescent lights give a warmer tone to them. So pick the appropriate one. Now my white balance was pretty good as shot, so I'm going to keep it as shot. 2 other ways that you are able to use or adjust white balance is using the Eyedropper Tool. The Eyedropper Tool, you will click on a white portion in the image or a spot that's supposed to be white. If it gives you that little blurp sound, that means that it's too bright and you can't actually pick the white balance area. So I'm just going to pick an arbitrary point for right now just to demonstrate how it changes. And since I picked more of a bluey spot, it really gave it more of a tint and a warm tone to it. And you can just kind of pick around and see how it adjusts based on the different spots. But again, using that tool, you want to make sure that you select an area in your image that's supposed to be white. And the third way to adjust your white balance is to use the temperature and tint sliders. So you can warm up your image or cool it down just using this slider. I think that's pretty good for this image. Now moving on to other parts of the basic panel, we've got our exposure. Moving it to the right opens up or increases the exposure. Moving it to the left decreases the exposure. This image, I'm going to slightly increase the exposure, not too much. Moving on to contrast. Personally, I like contrasty images, so typically I will increase the contrast for my images. Highlights, for this instance, I'm going to decrease the highlights, and you're going to really notice more detail comes back in the cloud area. So decreasing those highlights, I'm seeing a lot more detail come back in through here. I'm going to increase the shadow area, and you're going to see down by the boat really starts to open up. And then I'm going to, typically I like to open up my whites and make them whiter, but in this case I'm going to lose a lot of detail. So for this specific image, I'm going to move them down a bit. And then typically I like to make my blacks blacker, but again, I'm going to actually increase that just slightly and make it more sort of even tone. So texture, clarity, and dehazing. Now I'm going to actually zoom in on my image. I'm going to zoom into the water area just so that you can actually see the difference here. So when I increase the texture, you're going to see that it almost gets more clear. So gives harder edges versus decreasing it makes it almost hazy looking. I'm going to slightly increase my texture. I won't make it too high, but just increase it a bit. Give it that nice sharp edge. Same with clarity. Clarity makes it a lot clearer or a lot more hazy. this image, I'm going to increase my clarity just a touch. And holding Option as I click on dehaze will actually show me where I'm removing haze from my image. So if I zoom out and show you the whole image for this, when I click Option and then the slider, you're going to see the boat really starts to come into focus or appear when I'm holding both Option and clicking on that slider. When I'm not clicking Option, you just see the image itself. So dehazing removes that haze that you sometimes get at certain hours with the sun. For this image, we don't really need to remove too much haze. So I'm going to actually just I'm going to actually leave it at 0. But just to show you how to get back to 0, if you move the slider and you want it back at your 0 point or your starting point, double click on the slider and it goes right back to 0. Going on to Vibrance and Saturation. So Vibrance and Saturation, a lot of people think they do the exact same thing. Saturation will increase all colors equally. So meaning the greens will be increased, greens, blues, and purples will be increased similarly or the exact same as the yellows, oranges, and reds. Now the only problem with that is the reds, yellows, and oranges have a much tighter wavelength. So when we actually see or perceive the color red, the wavelength is much tighter than that of blues, greens, and purples. So we're going to actually see it more intensely than we would the blues, greens, and purples. So if we want to see it adjusted equally to the way our eye sees it, we will actually increase the vibrance over the saturation. So keep that in mind when we're adjusting different colors. If you want to adjust your whole image equally to the way that the eye sees it, you want to adjust vibrance over saturation. So keep that in mind because that's going to be a key thing moving forward. I like more colorful images, so I'm going to increase the vibrance to about 30 or so. Perfect, so that does the basic panel. I'm going to close down the basic panel. I'm going to open up the curve panel. Now you can have it on either the panoramic curve, the edit point curve, red channel, green channel, or blue channel. I would encourage you to keep it on point curve. That way you can add as many points as you want on this curve. Typically we like to make an S curve. So that is increasing our highlights a little bit and decreasing our shadows. That gives us a little bit more of a contrastier image. I'm going to close down the curve panel now. And opening the detail panel, we have our sharpening, noise reduction, and color noise reduction. So if we hold our Option and click on our sharpening tool, you'll notice it goes black and white or grayscale. Now if we zoom in, you're going to be able to see how it affects your image at full scale. So you always want to be about 100 or so %. So I'm going to show you here, we've got it at 111%, and you can see that in the bottom left-hand corner, how much you've zoomed into your image. So holding Option and clicking on the sharpening will make it grayscale. When we bring it down, you'll notice it almost gets like a cloudy or unclear. And as we sharpen it, it gets more contrasty or more sharp, so clearer. For this specific image, I think I kind of like it around 57 or so. For noise reduction, you're not going to see a ton of difference in this specific image just because there's hardly any noise, or at least that's not visible at 100%. And same with color noise reduction. Again, since there's not much noise, you're not going to see a drastic difference with that. So I'm going to close that down. I'm going to zoom back out now. And down the right-hand side of the program, you're going to see the different options or different tools. So we have our edit, we've got our crop and rotate, we have spot removal. Spot removal is going to be really handy in future lessons when we're removing things like acne and stuff from portraits. We've got our adjustment brushes, our graduated filter, radial filters, red eye removal, etc., etc. I'll touch on adjustment brushes in a future lesson because those are pretty important and it allows you to spot edit certain spots within your image. But right now we're just really focusing on global edits. So edits that are affecting the entirety of your image. And clicking on the crop and rotate tool, you can adjust the aspect ratio. Now, if you remember in last class, we talked about the aspect ratio versus cropping to size. Cropping to an aspect ratio gives you just a ratio crop. So for instance, a 2x3 could be 2 inches by 3 inches, 4 inches by 6 inches, 8 inches by 12 inches, etc., etc. Or a 4x5 aspect ratio crop could be 4 by 5 inches, 8 by 10 inches, 20 by 25 inches. It all depends. A ratio is just that. It's a ratio. It's not an exact size. So for this image, I think I'm going to adjust it to a 4 by 5 ratio. So that's not 4 inches by 5 inches. It's just a 4 by 5 ratio. And then I'm going to adjust the angle because if you notice, what's driving me nuts in this image is the horizon is actually at an angle. So we're actually falling off to the left in this image. And we're going to adjust that so that the horizon is actually horizontal. So we've got a nice little grid that shows up when we click on our angle. And we're going to make it nice and even there. And I think I kind of like just about there. 2/3 sky, 1/3 water. And I just hit enter to apply that crop. Now, I'm pretty satisfied with where we are here. Now, to save this image, all you have to do is actually click done. And that's going to save it with your raw file. So your raw file is then going to automatically have an XMP file created along with it. And that XMP file will hold all of the data in terms of the edits that we've made to our raw image. If we wanted to save it as something else, we can do that. But for right now, we're just going to save this as our raw file. So by clicking done, that will automatically save our XMP, or it creates an XMP. So I just had this image on my desktop. So I'm going to close Bridge, and you'll notice that I've got, that's not the file I wanted to click on. We've got our XMP of Trinidad, and we also have our raw file. So if this was the assignment, I would have to submit this raw file, so trinidad.cr2, along with trinidad.xmp. These two files together allow me to see your edits. And notice that they're labeled the exact same. So if you change the label or the naming convention of your XMP, you need to change the naming convention of your CR2 so that they match exactly. If they do not match exactly, they will not talk to one another, and they will not be able to show me the edits that you have made. Alrighty. That's about it for the little brief on Adobe Camera Raw. If you guys have any questions, send me an email or write me in our DC Connect, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Alrighty. Cheers, guys.